correctly with the correct amount.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Welcome to Me and Steve Talk RPGs, a podcast where me and my friend Steve try and help you get the most out of your role-playing game experience. Welcome back to Me and Steve Talk RPGs, and yet again this week you only have one Steve because other Steve's internet provider decided to, do something and not work for him about an hour ago.
Well, he's here in spirit. Second Steve is here in spirit.
Yes, that he would be. And in any case, you hear the voice of our guest for this episode, who would be Chris Landauer, also known around the internet as Savage Bull, and we'll get to him in a minute. But before that, I want to talk to you real quick about our D20 Network podcast of the week, which this week is going to be Guardians of the Wills, which is a Star Wars Legends discussion podcast where they talk about, be it Bad Batch is out right now, quite a good series. I'm enjoying it myself, but that, various books, other media, and these guys are massive Star Wars fans. It's actually mostly the same crew from Staggering Dragon, the actual play podcast. It's also on the network. So you can check them out. It's at guardiansofthewills.wordpress.com/category/GOTW. And to make that a whole bunch easier, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. So with that done, let's get back to our guest and our topic for the week, which is Savage Worlds. And our guest is Christopher Landauer. And he is, part of a number of things that spread from a group called the Rocky Mountain Savages. And I think from there, maybe you should take over and explain it yourself, Chris.
Yeah, when you guys were looking for guests, I think the call was for a Savage World super fan. And so I eagerly jumped up and down and waved my hand around. And I think I qualify. If not, then I will knife fight anyone else who claims to be a Savage World super fan. But yeah, so I'm a co-manager of the Rocky Mountain Savages, like you mentioned. It was a club founded by Chris Fox, Neil Hyde, in the Rocky Mountains, Denver. And it is the largest Savage Worlds fan club and probably one of the largest kind of role-playing clubs. I guess in the United States, that makes it in the universe. It's kind of like the Miss Universe pageant. Like once you get the United States and then like you make a hint about the rest of the world, you can start claiming that you're the biggest in the universe and then the galaxy or whatever one is bigger. I think the galaxies and then universes. Anyways, we're just a bunch of rabid Savage Worlds fans who get together multiple times a year to play Savage Worlds. And we put on events elsewhere than the Rocky Mountains, like we do the Savage Cruise. And we're doing another one of those at the beginning of next year. We put on Savage Expeditions, which are a little more land-based Savage Worlds fun. We're going to Deadwood this year in August. Gosh, Fox and I run the Savage Cast podcast where we just talk about Savage Worlds. And we're also a licensed Savage Worlds publisher. The book you probably heard from us through Yellow Piece Games is Buccaneer Through Hell and High Water, which is like Pirates of the Caribbean for Savage Worlds. And that's most of what I do. Putting on, currently organizing kind of a marketing and events and actual plays for Pinnacle as well. So lots of Savage Worlds on my calendar.
Well, it certainly sounds like you qualify as a Savage World superfan in that case.
I hope so. I can pad the resume a little bit more with some made up stuff, but I don't think I need to.
We're gamers. That's what we do, right? And besides, if you've got a couple Canadians in the Rocky Mountain Savages, then you can definitely claim to be the biggest in the world because it's the World Series and there's a couple teams in Canada and they call it the World Series.
Right, so. Exactly. Or from Colorado, like we do love Canadians and their sports because half of our championship trophies in the state are because we bought a Canadian hockey team at their peak and they came and won us a couple Stanley Cups back to back. So go Avalanche. And we're big fans of the Canucks.
Yeah. No, I actually grew up about 3 hours from Niagara Falls, so
gorgeous part of the country.
Yeah, a little farther now, but not terribly far. But in any case, Savage Worlds has been around for quite a while, and if I'm not mistaken, didn't it basically evolve out of the original Deadlands that came out in the early 90s?
Yeah, so this year is the 25th anniversary of Deadlands, and that's pretty exciting. 25 years is a respectable silver anniversary for an RPG. And then the original Savage Worlds, kind of some of the rule set came out of the Great Rail Wars board game, tabletop game, and then the innovations from Deadlands, and then the kind of Shane and crew slimmed it down into its own more universal system, so it wasn't just tied to Deadlands. And then kind of the Padawan surpassed the master in that regard, and now Deadlands is run with Savage Worlds. So it's kind of come full circle. But yeah, it's we're approaching, I think, 20 years plus with Savage Worlds. I think 2003 is when it officially came out as Savage Worlds. So close to almost 2 decades.
Very nice. Yeah, I find the setting for Deadlands fascinating, but I don't know if it's just because I'm old and nostalgic, but part of me, if I'm going to play Deadlands, I want to play Deadlands Classic and use all the chips and the cards and everything, because I remember somebody that I knew in college had it, but I never got to play.
Yeah, it's super themed out, right? Like
Exactly.
the crunch matches the setting very nicely with, dealing cards to create your powers, and the different types of poker chips. And Savage Worlds takes those elements and kind of just streamlines them. So instead of multiple different colors of chips, you get one kind of Benny basically. And whereas in classic Deadlands, the different colored bennies, some you could get a reroll, but the game master would get a Benny as well. Some you get bonuses with. So that's been streamlined for basic Savage Worlds. And similarly, like the cards also make their way into Savage Worlds to a great degree. For instance, initiative is handled by cards. Mm-hmm. And which is kind of a part of the reason it's a little it's a faster system than what some people you're used to in D20. Not that dealing cards is inherently faster than rolling dice. It's just the fact that getting everybody, like one person does the work and then you can just run down the cards versus everybody rolling, figuring out what they rolled, telling you what they rolled, and and the fact that it changes up every time, kind of versus some of the more static combat systems is kind of fun. So the cards definitely make their presence known there. There's also a lot of subsystems that use cards. So if you're doing things like dramatic tasks, you draw cards to give you inspiration on kind of what, or on interludes, you draw cards to give you inspiration on kind of what to talk about. And because each of the suits has their own theme. And we've got like new chase rules that come with their own chase deck that each card has its own kind of mechanic to play with. So there's a lot of fun in Savage Worlds that's still clearly inspired and derived from the original Deadlands.
Well, yeah, I didn't mean that it wasn't. That I remember seeing it way back when, and so part of me that's how I want to try it at least once.
Oh, yeah, no, it is still a very playable system. I mean, and I agree with you. The level of cohesion between mechanics and setting are really great in the classic Deadlands.
So I guess we kind of started there, and we talked a little bit before the show. I'm somewhat familiar with it. I'm actually about halfway through reading my copy of the Savage Worlds core book, but the dice system is unique, I guess, is a way to put it. And now, is this what they call a roll and keep system, or is this just a weird dice pool? How would you classify it?
I think it's kind of unique for either of those. So the one thing that like different than roll and keep is you don't have to keep your rolls. The nice thing about Savage Worlds is bennies are a major part of how the system works. And what bennies are, it's short for benefits, and it's kind of a free reroll system. So not actually free. Every player starts with 3 bennies at the beginning of a session, and the expectation is that more bennies will be flowing from the game master during the session. So it's not just you only get 3 period. You use them and you're done. They're kind of there's a whole action economy based around bennies, and so what you can do with bennies is if you make a roll that you don't like, you can spend a benny and re-roll it. And so that's a nice aspect of bennies, is it gives players agency. And then they're also used for when your character takes damage. You can soak the damage by spending a benny and making a roll. And if you succeed on that roll, then the damage didn't happen, or you negate some of the damage. So the basic dice mechanic for Savage Worlds is pretty simple. For most actions, you need a 4 or better on the dice that you're rolling. And the dice that you roll, the traits in the game, which are like attributes and skills. Attributes are qualities that define kind of how your character is made, and then skills are things that you've been trained in, and so the kind of the nature and nurture, those two things. Most systems have those, right? You've got your smarts, intelligence, wisdom, those kind of things in systems. Savage Worlds has those, and those are the attributes. And then skills are things that you're studied in and things that you're good at, like fighting or research. And they're measured in die types. So if you're untrained, you're a D4 -2. The first time you spend any points being trained, you get a D4 in a skill, and then you keep raising those up to D12s. And after D12, you start adding pluses to your rolls. And then because you're a player character, we call you a wild card. And wild cards are player characters, and then some of the bad guys who are the little more bossy types, they're also wild cards. And wild cards get their 3 wounds, and you also get a wild die. And for most characters and most players, that's a D6 that you get to roll as an additional chance at success. So basic roll, like if I'm like, hey, make a notice check, you look at your skills, you've got like a D6 in notice, you got a D6 for your wild die, so you roll the 2D6. And if either of those dice get to a 4 or better, you don't add them, you keep them separate. If either of them is a 4 or better, you succeed. And then every multiple of 4 above a 4, so an 8 is what's called a raise. And raises just indicate that something either better happens, or if you're causing damage and you're doing an attack. If you're doing an attack, you get an extra damage dice to roll. And if you're doing damage, every 4 above your target number is an additional wound. So the 4 is kind of a mostly a magic number. It's most of the time you're looking for 4 or better. And for a lot of people, that sounds low because you're looking at other systems. Like I kind of came from GURPS, and so you're rolling 3d6, and you're like 10 was kind of average, and higher was better. And a lot of times the number you're looking for to roll is higher. So 4 sounds like a pretty low number, but the way Savage Worlds works, by kind of narrowing that range to a 4 and kind of the limited number of dice, you're kind of rolling typically 2 dice, your trait dice, and then your wild die, and keeping it to a 4 or better for a success. It makes the game run pretty quickly. It's it's a fast game to resolve what's going on.
Yeah, well, I know that the tagline for the system is Fast, Furious, Fun. So, I assume that's based off of how it plays.
Yeah, right. And some people take that to mean that it's like a super rules light system, and it's not. It's a medium crunch system. But I do think that the level of crunch doesn't really bog it down. I actually think in some regards, less crunchy systems are even slower to play, because at some point when you're in a sandbox and you don't have a piece of crunch to resolve a simple question that you're asking, like, do I see this? Can I attack it? Do I hit it? And you're a little more on the like, let's come to a consensus and let's talk about it kind of things. You can never reach a conclusion on those systems, or they're so open-ended that just even thinking of how you'd approach it takes a good amount of time. So it's medium crunch, but it's definitely on the fast end for resolving combat. Again, loved GURPS, but GURPS would be hey guys, we're going to build up to the big combat, and then maybe we'll get through the one combat in one night, maybe. And, several hours in. Whereas Savage Worlds, we run a lot of convention games, and we have 3 or 4 hours to get through a satisfying adventure. And usually that means 3 or 4 scenes. And, at least 2 to 3 of those can be combats. And so, about an hour per combat with a table of 5 to 6 players. That's a pretty good as far as, kind of the economy of your time versus what you accomplish in the game goes.
Yeah. And then the one other thing that I noticed reading it, and I believe this is only for wild cards, but all dice in Savage Worlds explode, correct?
So and they explode for enemies too. So that's one of the more fun mechanics, where if you roll, Shane prefers to call it acing, but we like exploding because it sounds more fun than acing. But yeah, if you roll a 6 on a d6 or a 4 on a d4, you get to keep rolling that die and adding the results until it stops exploding. So that's kind of one of the other mechanics within Savage Worlds that keeps it very cinematic, very fun, and very anticipatory. Where you're not, everything's not very rote. So the kind of things that keep the system on your toes, and everybody's kind of interested in what's happening, is Yeah, dice explode, and that is fantastic. That always, gets the table excited. And then when you're dealing initiative, if you get dealt a joker, everybody at the table gets an extra Benny. So there's a lot of excitement that goes around the table when jokers are dealt. And there are edges that you can take that can kind of manipulate how many cards you get. And so some wise people have figured out how to play a more tactical kind of meta game with the system to increase the number of jokers that hit the table by running through a lot of cards. So, for instance, there's like level-headed. If you're level-headed in combat, it means you get to draw 2 cards and pick the better of the 2 that you want to use. But there's also quick, and so the quick allows you that you will not go below a 5. So that's one of those, if you combine the two, or you have multiple players at the table who each have it, or one has one and one has the other, you can start running through some of the lower cards, because the character who needs a 5 or better, as the game master is dealing cards, a 2, a 4, a 3, a 2. Yeah, nope, those don't count. Keep dealing. And so you kind of run through the deck faster. And in general, most people don't reshuffle until a joker's been drawn. So, getting through that deck is kind of part of the meta game that's fun in Savage World. So between, bennies, being able to spend bennies, exploding dice, there's a lot of uncertainty with the mechanics that keep the game fun and keep people paying attention. So
Yeah, no, and it sounds to me too like with the exploding dice and where, so to speak, pretty much every roll has a puncher's chance. That,
mhm.
well, yes, you can, and no pun intended here, but in a meta sense, you can stack the deck to your advantage. But it's not like you can just stack all these bonuses and know that you have the best goblin killer ever, and you're never going to run into a goblin that can beat you.
Yeah, and that's the cool thing. There are some famous examples online of people who, in other various, usually D20 systems, but it also works for things like GURPS, where, you can create the loophole character that is, god tier effective because you combine this feat with this magic item, and that compounds with, that really doesn't exist in Savage Worlds because it's not nearly as rigid or fixed. But it does exist in kind of the fun of that exists in the fact that you can be killed at any time, because the enemies can have their dice explode as well. And there are runs where they can roll 40, 50, 60 points of damage against you. And there's, little hope of soaking that damage. And you're kind of at that point just hoping to save your bennies for the incapacitation table to see if it, you insta die, or whether you can get away with a permanent injury or something else that's fun and thematic. But same way for characters, is that there isn't the kind of ablative whittle away at a super HP monster that's going to take you, no matter what, that on the third attack of against whatever the big monster is, you're not going to kill it. You're just at best going to take a chunk of its hit points down, and then down until finally someone kills it. In Savage Worlds, the kind of swing nature of exploding dice means that you can luck out and get a roll and just roll a fantastic amount of damage. And but they're not even insta kills, because the game masters have bennies too, and the game masters can attempt to soak. So there is that back and forth on, fantastic hits, great damage, could be a potential kill. Oh, but the game master soaks 2 of the wounds, so it's only kept 1 of its wounds, but it's still shaken and wounded. And so there are elements of both of those. And kind of the nice thing is, like, if you look at the newer material that we're putting out for the Savage Pathfinder for Savage Worlds, Pathfinder, the kind of the hit point system is more a part of that ethic. So the designers on the team have found ways of marching Savage Worlds with the setting rules for Savage Pathfinder a little closer to not being able to just one-shot all the big bads, keeping some of the big bads have edges that allow them to, at most take a wound from, any one hit. So, you're not going to get, you do need to at least wound it, 3 times, or things like that. So some of those mechanics, obviously they're not going to recreate, hey, 500 hit points or whatever, but they do take it away from, in a nice modular kind of customized ability from Savage Worlds core.
Yeah, like I said, it's a game that I'm really, really intrigued by it. And again, I told you this, before we started recording, because where it really caught my attention, I'd heard about it here and there, and it's like, okay, yeah. And then I realized that Palladium licensed the Rifts property to Pinnacle, and so they're putting out the Savage Rifts. And Rifts is an amazing world, but the Palladium engine, while it isn't terrible in play, character creation is a nightmare. And back when I was running it when I was in college and I had a lot more time and I was a lot more into the system, whatever, it still took me better than an hour to create a character from scratch. And that's just stats. That's not writing down any backstory, any sort of development. That's getting the numbers on the page. And for lack of a better way to say it, at this point in my life, now that I'm an adult and I have a job and I have a house, I have to cut the grass, I have to, et cetera, and so on. I just don't have time for that, and nor do most of the people that I now play with. So this Savage Rifts thing was really intriguing, and then a bunch of the Savage Rift stuff was on Humble Bundle, and I went, okay, for $25. Yep.
Right, easy choice, easy choice.
And then I'm like, I got to go get the core book because I need the core book. And then it's like, oh, there's all this other neat stuff, be it Deadlands or, like 50 Fathoms. And then, then I became aware of, and I don't remember what it's called, but you mentioned it, the community content program that Savage Worlds is doing.
Yeah, there's two of them. There's Aces, and then there's a Swag, which is the Adventurers Guild. So the Adventurers Guild is folks who are just beginning to dip their toes in. It's like fan content, right? Like the expectation is all on them to quality control. But if you have a cool little idea you want to throw out there and see if people like it, it's a very generous program. You can post it up and see if people like it. And then one step up from that is a licensed ACE publisher, and these are people who've already demonstrated that they've got the sort of quality control, not just in terms of mechanics, but also in terms of presentation, for art and layout. And the ACE publishers usually go for more like setting style books. So, instead of being smaller supplements, they'll kind of go for something that's in the, 50 to 100 plus pages kind of setting books and things that can be printed. And that's what we did with Buccaneer Through Hell and High Water. We actually it turned into like a 300-page book. But yeah, we actually had that printed. Yeah, and so those are kind of two nice ways that the community can bring content to Savage Worlds, as well as all of the official Pinnacle settings that are in-house, and then the licensed settings, like things like Rifts, and Pathfinder and Lankmar. So Savage Worlds is kind of got a really good mix of everything from licensed material to licensee material on that kind of spectrum, which is it's part of the reason I think our community is so supportive and kind of growing. Is you can find your place here. There's definitely a place for a whole different line of gamers, and like you said, all of us are really kind of conscious of time. And I think if you look at the community content and the stuff that Pinnacle's putting out, a lot of it is very much focused on time. Even if if you look at the current Flash campaign, they've got Flash Gordon, which is a licensed property, and the Savage Rifts property, and even the kind of the Big Daddy, the recent the acquisition of a great fantasy property with Pathfinder. If you look at what they're putting out besides the core books, there's a lot of other little bits that are kind of coming in the box sets that are all about saving you time. So like archetype cards are super time savers. So if you want to put together a battle with goblins, right? Or if you're in Flash Gordon, you want to some of Ming's henchmen, you just pull the archetype card out, and it's got all the stats right there on the card, ready for you to use. And if you want a little less easier version of it, you can drop those down by a die type or remove an edge. If you want to beef them up and have them be a commander, you add an edge and kind of move one or two of the die types up. So the archetype cards are kind of one of the things that's nice about Savage Worlds. And even without that, even without the published materials, one of the really cool things about Savage Worlds that keeps it easy to run for those of us who are on the Game Master side is for mooks, or characters that are you're not expecting to have a lot of complex interaction with characters, whether they're there to delay the characters or ambush characters, but they're not, they don't know the secret machinations. You can really give them one or two stats, like you give them D6 and whatever they need. If they're really good, a D8. If they're kind of schleps, maybe a D4. And if it comes up on the top of your head, that's really all you need to do. And for those, there's a common game mechanic for non-wild card enemies where it's called up, down, or off the table. So they only have one hit. And then in Savage Worlds, one of the mechanics, the basic mechanics of the game is that the first time you're hit by an enemy and it surpasses your toughness, which is kind of means it gets through your armor, there's a status called Shaken. And so shaken basically it limits your options if you are shaken, so it's good to become unshaken. And then if you're shaken a second time while you're shaken, you'll get a wound from it. And then if you're attacked and you reach your toughness when they're attacking you, if their damage reaches your toughness, you're shaken. If they go 4 above, you get your first wound, 8 above, your second wound, etc. So shaken. So for kind of table management, if you're using miniatures, if an enemy miniature is standing, they're ready to go. If they're laying down, it means they're shaken. So you have to the roll to unshake before they can really get their full range of attacks and abilities against you. And then if they're wounded, you just pull them off the table. One wound, they're done. And so that's a way that you can literally throw dozens of miniatures down on the table and manage them without having to really even take notes on a lot of the effects. So that's kind of a nice way of keeping it, even with complex, larger battles, you can still keep it pretty fast.
Yeah, that sounds cool. That's that's one thing I did notice reading the book is that it does feel like it is geared to run quickly. If nothing else, it just keeps everyone more engaged in what's going on. Unlike certain D20 games that are notorious for, okay, I finished my turn, I'm going to go, check Facebook for 20 minutes till it's my turn again or longer.
Right, exactly. And Savage Worlds just avoids that, one, by making any one character's turn faster. Two, the initiative changes every round. So, paying attention is beneficial. But three, there are a lot of elements of Savage Worlds like support that even when it's not your turn, and even if you don't have an action, you can still aid in the support of other characters. That's a kind of a nice part of the system, is that the kind of mechanics do keep you engaged, not only with what your character is choosing to do, but what other characters are doing as well. And then there are a lot of things like dramatic tasks where everybody's involved in a dramatic task, but instead of doing it turn based, everybody's kind of acting at the same time. So a dramatic task, like an example, is like defusing a bomb, right? Not every character in if you're playing a group of, like a police procedural, and you're playing a group of like SWAT team members, and you've broken into where the hostage is, but the hostage has a bomb vest on them, and instead of running it by round, where everybody's drawing initiative cards and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the game master can say, we're going to do a dramatic task. You guys have three rounds to get 2 successes apiece. So if you have like 4 players, you need a total of 8 among all of you, 8 successes to successfully defuse this bomb. And the players can tell you what their characters are doing. So one of them might be a bomb tech, and they're going to say, okay, well, I'm going to use my repair skill, which is kind of the skill that we use for everything from fixing things to engaging with mechanics, to try to defuse the bomb. And then another character is like, well, I'm going to try to use my persuasion skill to calm down the victim here so that they don't accidentally set the bomb off. And then the 2 other characters like, okay, I'm going to do Overwatch I'm going to use my shooting skill to, provide ground cover to keep the terrorists at bay from breaking into the room. And then the 4th character is like, okay, I'm going to use my leadership skill to my knowledge battle to organize everybody and keep the information flowing between everybody so we know what's going on. And if we fail, we can wish our hostage well, but we can throw them behind the concrete bunker so we don't get blown up in the blast or whatever. So you announce what skill you're using, and then you're rolling against that skill every round and seeing how many successes you add to the pool, or if you get a critical failure, you could remove successes from the pool. But in that kind of dramatic task, instead of doing regular combat with all the crunch, it's getting a little more narrative, but you are kind of incorporating everybody at the same time, and they're helping each other. You're helping each other out. So same thing with like assisting. You can assist other characters in what they're doing, and you don't even have to always have the skill based upon game master approval that they're using. So if you have another means of assisting the situation, you can make a pleaded case to the game master and say, hey, I'd like to help out these guys. Even if you don't have lock picking, but you can, you do have like something like scrounging. You can find something, like, okay, I'm gonna try to search to see if there's a manual for this safe in the guy's desk. Because of course he kept the manual for the safe in the desk. So you'd use notice to go search for the manual while the other character is using the lockpicks. If the character who's doing the searching gets a success, they give a +1 bonus to the character doing the lockpicking. So that's kind of how they can give you bonuses even if they don't have the lockpicking skill, that kind of stuff. So there is cooperative elements in the game that keep everybody engaged every round.
Yeah, no, I like stuff like that. Now, the one thing I did want to ask, and I may have skimmed past this in reading or may not have gotten to it yet, is it acceptable to use bennies to introduce narrative elements in the game? Like, for example,
Absolutely.
yeah, like you were saying about the manual for the safe. Can you just say, "Hey, I'm going to spend a Benny to say that the dude kept the manual to the safe in his desk and we found it."
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, there are. You can spend bennies to do narrative effects. Of all the things you can do with bennies, so that, yeah, so narrative effects are definitely one of them. In games that have fantasy elements that have powers, and Savage Worlds uses powers for everything from, like, fantasy spells to, if you are a superhero and you have actual powers, to weird tech, so like steampunk and technological advances. Like, so if you have a laser gun, you can use the power that is associated, like, whether it's a, like, that would probably be a you could do like a blast or a burst. Those are kind of the, shooting a stream versus making an explosion in an area of effect. You pick one of those powers, and then how you mold it to the and customize it to the setting you're in are something that the system calls trappings. So a weird scientist or a mad scientist using a laser gun could very much be the exact same power as an eldritch witch who's bringing lightning down from the heavens. Could be very much the same way as a character like Storm, who's collecting energy, from the environment, whether it's nature, whether the character is someone who can kind of get access to the power lines or batteries or whatever, and then shoot out an electrical ray. Those would all be the same. Or they could even be different, like, maybe Storm creates an area of effect with it, and the mad scientist creates a kind of a bolt that is similar to a shot. You shoot a bolt, at distance of lightning, but they'd all have the lightning trapping, and so they would also do stuff if it was relevant in the game that you could do with lightning, or you could have a fire trapping, or you could have trappings are kind of they don't have to have a mechanical effect. They can just be a narrative effect, like a creepy glow, or whatever. But if they do have something that's logical at any given time for a mechanical effect, those can be applied from as well. So you can spend a Benny to get more power points back. So the game runs on power points. The different powers have their base cost in power points, and then if you want to make them, a larger attack or a larger area of effect, or have them last longer, or make them armor piercing, or those kind of things, you can spend more power points when you activate them. And then in most settings, over time, you gain power points back, but you can also gain power points back in settings by spending bennies. And bennies, you can re-roll trait rolls. You can also re-roll damage rolls. The other rolls you make, like things like soaking. Soaking is how you get rid of wounds. You can spend bennies on that. So yeah, so bennies have a range of kind of uses in the game, and that's kind of why the benny economy is what a popular term we use is kind of an important way of setting the tone for what kind of game you're playing. And that's kind of one of the other elements that Savage Worlds is really great at, is that there are setting rules. So it's not a one size fits all system for all the games it runs. Setting rules are kind of, in this setting, to make it more, pulpy cinematic versus horror, we use these setting rules. And the setting rules kind of just turn off and on features of the game. So for instance, like in a high horror game, you might not want to have bennies be as flowing. So you might say, in this horror setting, each character only gets 3 bennies per session and you don't earn more. Or you might say, this is a setting rule that's become a standard rule of the system with Suede, the new edition, is that the being able to re-roll critical failures. So in previous editions, you could re-roll critical failures, and now in Suede Core, if you get a critical failure, you can't spend a Benny on it. You got to take if you get Snake Eyes on your trait and Wild Eye, it's a critical failure, and the game master gets to give you the fun effects from that. So those kind of setting rules allow you to customize how the system plays for whatever kind of genre you're playing in.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, that was something I did want to touch on, because like we have a lot of listeners that are very into the Genesis system or the Star Wars RPG from Fantasy Flight, now Edge Studios. And it's also built as a generic system. And I think, like based on my experience, what that really does well is cinematic action. And I was curious if Savage Worlds kind of has a vein that it's, what do you want to say, the best at. Like I know it was designed as as a generic, somewhat settingless system, and so it's not like, well, we're going to take the mechanics from D&D and we're going to play whatever else with it. No, it's built to be adapted, but like, does it have, like, it strikes me that it really likes pulp action.
And that's fair, right? And I think that comes from, well, one, it's true. It does do pulp action very well. I think that also comes from the fact that it's a little unique in the role playing game milieu for being a system that can handle that, right? Whereas I think GURPS particularly handles modern police and military very well because of that 3d6 bell curve feels real. Like it feels like you're living in the real world with it, and you don't really get to re-roll very often unless you've got a very rare and very expensive, luck. So GURPS makes you eat your rolls, and the details on what you get shot in the pinky. Well, yes, you can. So those kind of elements make it feel a little more gritty and modern. And there aren't a lot of pulp games in kind of the a lot of there's a lot of D&D and D&D clones that do high fantasy. So Savage Worlds is unique in that regard. That if you wanted to play that genre, Savage Worlds is the kind of the game you'd pick up to play that. And so that's a totally fair assessment. I also think that a lot of the new setting rules and the fact that if you look at the two big properties like Rifts and Savage Pathfinder, if it can do pulp and investigative horror kind of things, and one of the in-house settings is called East Texas University. It'd be like Supernatural or Buffy, that kind of vibe of young investigative horror, school-aged horror. If you can go from there, and then you can also run Pathfinder and Rifts, and then something that's very cheeky in space like Flash Gordon. I do think it's very adaptable, and so the fact that you can turn on and off setting rules, and then the kind of the customizations for Rifts and Savage Pathfinder have a lot of custom mechanics that aren't in core, that are kind of guided to evoke the feeling of Palladium and of Pathfinder and Paizo without going. They still are Savage Worlds. If you wanted full on Palladium, or if you wanted full on Pathfinder, you could just go play those, right? We are not making the case that you shouldn't play those. We love playing those games, but they're a different style of play and a different appeal to those systems. So if you want a more Savage Worlds-esque experience, you can definitely get those there. So 100% agree. Pulp is probably the first answer most people would give you. I like it personally I think most of the settings that get published in Savage Worlds are alt history with weirdness. So there's a whole list of them, and there's like they do the Weird Wars line, which is Weird Wars 1, Weird Wars 2. There's the Vietnam War. There's Weird Wars Rome that really kind of looks at alt history, but you throw in the weirdness and you kind of amp up the horror elements. The Deadlands has a whole different line that's kind of diverse. So in addition to the traditional Deadlands, there's Deadlands Noir, which kind of goes into like the New Orleans, mafioso noir, black and white style kind of gameplay. Hell on Earth goes to the post-apocalyptic tropes. And then there's Deadlands Lost Colony, which kind of takes all of that and advances it into the future and does some space with it. But even like in the Westerns, right? So like there's Deadlands, but there's also like the Sixth Gun, which is its own comic flavor of the Old West. And there's Space 1889, which is kind of where you kind of bridge the Old West and the Victorian and the kind of planetary romance. So so Savage Worlds kind of does it all, but I do think there is that element where and then like Last Parsec. Well, Last Parsec is like, it's definitely the sci-fi, it's definitely space, but it's more on the hard sci-fi versus the kind of planetary space romance you get with Slipstream or Flash Gordon. Or my favorite era of Savage Worlds kind of comes in between like the Age of Sail and that kind of era. So you've got, they did Solomon Kane, and they did the Pirates of the Spanish Main, and you've got Rippers, which is kind of the classic monsters, the Victorian monsters, but they throws in some bioengineering and that kind of stuff. So I think Savage Worlds really does sing when you take alt history and throw in some weirdness to kind of give yourself an access of freedom on deviating from history, but also kind of you get the game elements we all like to play in fantasy, right? You can play characters that can sling spells or have superpowers. Oh, and there's a whole bunch. I mean, supers. It does supers really well as well. The necessary evil is kind of the one of the great super settings for it, where you get to play Earth is invaded by an evil alien race, and most of these superheroes are taken out during the initial invasion. So it's up to the super villains to save Earth. And so they're kind of, that's what the necessary evil refers to. So that's a fun spin on some of the other systems. So I think Savage Worlds does a great job of taking traditional systems that people are used to playing and putting a spin on it, whether it's adding a little more horror elements, adding weirdness, putting a capital A in the alt for alt history. That's kind of where it shines.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sold. That kind of stuff is like, I love stuff that just kind of takes your expectations and twists them and tweaks them, or just flat out turns it on its head. That's like, I love that kind of thing in an RPG. That's and yeah, like, I'm honestly, and I don't know if I'm in a minority, but I feel like, compared to most people that I know, that I'm much less into fantasy RPGs than most other gamers that I know. Not that I don't like them, but like, at this stage, like, I'm fascinated by the Eberron setting, and I know Christian Serrano has the conversion he's put out for Eberron to Savage Worlds. I have a copy of it downloaded somewhere. But like, it seems like, up until, at least I'm not aware of anything other, specific traditional fantasy other than the upcoming, Savage Pathfinder stuff. But it sounds like a lot of the stuff that Savage Worlds has been doing is stuff that would really stir my imagination.
Yeah, well, and Savage Worlds runs fantasy well out of the box. I mean, the nice thing about Pathfinder is that there's, the twist for Pathfinder is less on the material and the assumptions of the setting and more on the mechanics, right? Very similar to Rifts, where it's, these are well-established, well-loved properties in their own right. We don't need to add a twist to Rifts. We don't need to add a twist to Pathfinder, but there's obviously a demand in the market, because those are two long-lasting and really popular properties. There's also just a demand for, like you said before, being able to sit down and play those quicker, versus the more in-depth kind of crunchy rules that D20 and Palladium system offer. So that's kind of the twist on those, right? The twist on those is showing that, yeah, Savage Worlds can absolutely do, Megaverse with stompy robots and leyline walkers and, genetic dog boys. And it can also do very traditional high fantasy. I've gotten to play some of the Pathfinder, and I've seen the development, and it is fantastic. I'm really excited about it. To me, I think it's kind of rejuvenated my appreciation for fantasy. And I agree with you 100% on the idea that there's a lot of us gamers who, not that we're down on fantasy, it's just that it makes up such a large percentage of the market share for role-playing games. And it makes up a big percentage of what we've all already played since we were, teens, right? So we've done it. We've scratched that itch. So there are a lot of things that role-playing games that have yet to touch. So I mean, that's kind of the neat thing about Savage Worlds, is that it does kind of go there. But one property you should definitely check out if you do want to get the fantasy itch in Savage Worlds, Lankmar. So the Fafhrd the Grey Mouser kind of setting, Lankmar, has been lovingly done in Savage Worlds, which is pre-Savage Pathfinder, so you can get the hardback books right away on Lankmar. And that's its own flavor of fantasy as well. So that is kind of nice that that is out there for those people who are curious on can Savage Worlds do fantasy. Check out Lankmar. It's a lot of fun. And then and in general, like, Shane's thrown in some fantasy elements to even the non-traditional fantasy games. So like the book that we release as a licensee is Buccaneer, which is very much Pirates of the Caribbean. So we added those kind of fantasy elements. But Savage Worlds did Pirates of the Spanish Main. They had that license for a good long time, and that was they did kind of fencing schools. Between like Solomon Kane, Pirates of Spanish Main, but they also did like another pirate setting called we talked about in the pre-show, 50 Fathoms, and that's a fun setting that really amps up the fantasy element. So you've got races that are just very piratey Caribbean created races, like Kraken and Crabmen and all these kind of wonderful things. That's even more fantastical, and whatever what uses of that word you'd like, than something a little more traditional, like straight up pirates or pirates with a little bit of fantasy. So yeah, the options are there.
Yeah, I was going to say 50 Fathoms on the surface struck me as a Deadlands take on Pirates of the Caribbean.
Very much, very much.
But yeah, now one thing I do want to ask, and hopefully we're all coming to the end of this pandemic thing and all that, and can really start playing around tables again more and more. But I did want to ask, with all the dice mechanics and the cards and et cetera, how well supported is Savage Worlds on the VTT spectrum? With Roll20 or Astral, or I know there's a ton of them out there.
So Shane likes to insist that Savage Worlds is still a very small company, or Pinnacle is a small company. But as a brag, I do think they punch above their weight class in terms of, one, just the kind of amount of material they put out, but two, on the VTT especially. On one of the platforms, I think we are the second or third most popular game played behind D&D, with a rather impressive market share. I think it's third behind D&D and Pathfinder, but it's a very impressive actual amount of VTT offerings. And there's actually an in-house VTT virtual tabletop team that, one, publishes material for the virtual tabletops and then facilitates the companies. So some of the VTT companies, they in-house create materials, and then other of the companies, you as the publisher have to create your materials in line with their platform. So our VTT team is excellent. It's headed up by Dr. Amy Marshall. You can see her on Twitch. There's a show called Virtual Table Talk, and they kind of bring on, whether it's Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds, or one of the new contenders in the VTT world, Foundry. But yeah, it's well supported on all those platforms, and obviously the big stuff gets out first. So Deadlands is a priority that is releasing on all those platforms, and then, but one of the nice things too, though, is even for the smaller kind of products, like Pinnacle did a little booster campaign recently for East Texas University called Study Abroad, where it's basically like a 90-some page adventure book that details stories you can go and adventures you can go take your college kids on overseas. And so it's like Poland, Great Britain, Italy, and Costa Rica are the four countries. But the Pinnacle released what's called do-it-yourself, DIY VTT assets. So even if the VTT companies don't have a module for you, when you back the crowdfunders and the Kickstarters, you can get a hold of the do-it-yourself VTT assets, so you can upload those character graphics right into the programs yourself. You can make your own pawns, or if the pawns are created, you can just import them into the game. It includes the maps. And then for stuff like Foundry and Roll20, where there's a lot of kind of macros and pre-done work that like adventure generators, or some of the more complicated tables or dice mechanics that require automation, you can buy those kits from those companies to really recreate all the things you need in the game. And those come with like the linkable books where you can cross-reference all the rules, bring up the adventure books formatted correctly. So I would say the Pinnacle gets a really high marks on VTT support, not only just in the getting the material onto the VTT, but supporting all the platforms as much as possible, especially the bigger ones. And then obviously the fans have returned the favor by making Savage Worlds one of the most highly played games on those systems. So I think that's kind of exciting. I think that brings more people to the game. And as you said, it just kind of shows the wealth of material that's out there for Savage Worlds. Will scratch a different itch than the traditional D20 systems. So, and Savage Worlds plays well on a VTT. There's the dice mechanics and the card mechanics are a little bit different than other games, but they're easy enough where, if the game has access to a card deck, you can run all the card deck stuff. If it has access to dice, you can run all the dice stuff. And pretty much all of them do, right? Like those aren't rare features. So Savage Worlds does benefit from being easily playable remotely and on a virtual tabletop platform.
That's cool. Yeah, that's one thing I wanted to ask about. And, this is another thing that I've learned, doing the podcasting and so forth is, and especially, when I was younger, you look at these books and you're thinking, oh, these have to be big companies to put out all this stuff. And perhaps a little more so back in the day. But like, even, I heard someone say, now that the number of RPG companies that have double digits of full-time staff is probably in single digits.
Yeah.
I know someone who just recently got hired as the assistant line developer for a fairly well-known title, like to the point where their name will now be the third name in line on the books. They're contracted at 10 hours a week.
Yeah, yeah.
To give people out there, yes, this is a big industry, but so much of even the big names in the industry, there's still people who work normal jobs, so to speak.
Oh, very much so, right? And it's interesting. It's definitely it's weighted at the ends, right? There are a massive popularity of a few very large companies that could rightfully be called corporate companies that can afford HR people who have nothing to do with the production of the games, right? Versus, and then it's heavily weighted on the other end for people who are serious fans who want to put out content, right? And there's just a lot, there's a high number of those at the bottom, and then there's a lot of popularity at the top, and then everybody else is kind of, interestingly in the middle. And it's, some of the realities. I mean, I'll get a little controversial here, but I think role-playing games are one of the interesting industries where I don't think the memory of being a fan in your teens and 20s has helped the industry hit modern price points for things. So what I mean by that is that a lot of us think that game manuals should be super cheap, $20 or less or $30 or less. And if you look at what a $40 book cost you 20 years ago and what one costs today, I mean, the prices haven't changed that much. Certainly not as much as costs have risen and inflation has risen. And yet the kind of the production values are really super high now. We definitely have this kind of, the games need to be full color art on every page or every other page. And, we're not doing cheap black and white printing anymore, or black and white art. We need very talented, high quality art on everything. And then that's going to be printed on glossy paper, and the books have to be hardbound, and they need to be so many pages. And there's the expectations, I think, are a little lagging behind where they need to be versus, say, board games, where I think kind of on the back end, when you start looking at being a producer in the industry, and I've got a little experience of this, with Buccaneer, and then with kind of pricing out some of our other projects, and then getting a little bit of a glimpse behind the scenes with Pinnacle. There's definitely a disconnect between like how much people are willing to pay for a board game and how much it costs to produce those versus what most people are willing to pay for RPG books and what it costs to produce those. And so I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that it does keep a lot of smaller kind of fan people from ever really making it big in the industry. And it does kind of slow us down from being able to have more full-time employees, just because the economics of it are very interesting. I mean, great. There are a couple companies they can get their games into the Walmarts of the world and do such a high volume and kind of diversify with other properties, whether it's like, I mean, you think about Wizards, Wizards and Magic, right? Magic became kind of the lifeblood for pretty much the whole industry as far as like friendly local game stores. Mm-hmm. The collectible card games really kept those people in business, even though a lot of us even just found collectible card games through role-playing games. But, Magic is, I think, probably obviously a larger, market share than some of the RPG stuff. But now you look at some of the things, and like RPGs are making a huge comeback, and RPGs, I think, for at least for the big corporate one, I think based upon their recent numbers, were bigger than their toy lines, which is crazy. Thinking that they're selling more books as far as dollars than they are selling toys in the toy aisles. That's kind of a crazy thing to think about. But the economics of RPGs are a strange beast, and it is kind of sad that a lot of the industry is part time, or half and half, or divided, or it's not. For as much as the fans are really well versed, I think of it this way: if you had to go to a family reunion, which RPG properties or companies would any of your relatives recognize the name of, right? So for those of us who are gamers, who are in the cult of gaming and kind of pop culture and nerddom, man, we've got a list. I could list 20 RPG settings that I own and play. When other people ask what I'm doing this weekend, or what you do for a living, or those kind of things, I don't know that very many people would be able to recognize anything probably other than Dungeons and Dragons, and probably most of those people are coming from the 80s satanic panic recognition of it, not necessarily the kind of the newer renaissance of D&D, whether it's the actual plays or kind of the growing Hollywood popularity of it. So yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the sad thing is, I mean, Star Wars certainly, but if you bring up Star Wars, how many people are like Star Wars D6 or Star Wars RPG versus, oh, you mean the 9 movies and all the toys and the Christmas special? So yeah, I think we are weird. We are a passionately supported niche market, but we're definitely kind of niche.
Yeah, well, I think, but some of that goes to because it's essentially, and my wife jerks my cord about this all the time. She goes, "You want more books to play pretend with," and I go, well, "Yes," but yeah, like it's completely different than pretty much any other form of entertainment or media or whatever, because you're buying this to then take it and make it your own. The closest thing I could think of really is maybe buying like painting kits, but then you get into, be it like the miniatures wargaming painting, and that's a whole nother thing, and that crosses in with gaming and etc. But yeah, I think it's also unique in that, so to speak, you're buying a guide, not the finished product in a lot of ways, or at least that's been the way I've experienced it through most of my gaming career.
I think that's fantastically intuitive of you, because, and it's true. I mean, for instance, like recently did an interview with Kevin Simbita from Riffs, right? And we were talking about, he had Jerry Bruckheimer on the line to create a Savage Riffs movie or a series of movies, and he wanted it to be his Star Wars. And part of that conversation, we were talking with him about it, was that why do you think that didn't happen? And similarly, like there's yet to be a really big Deadwood property, and that's true of a lot of really popular RPGs. Even though Hollywood is rushing around to snap up comic books and kind of other properties, there hasn't even been a really good Dungeons and Dragons movie yet. I mean, not to insult the work that's already been done, but something that really popped in the mainstream. And I think the reason behind that, or one of the reasons, is that yeah, you're right. We are not so much in the business of creating iconic characters and properties as far as intellectual property that would tell one story. We're in the business of telling infinite stories and of cooperative storytelling, not author-focused, one person steering it from beginning to the end to give you a very defined experience storytelling. So things like Hunger Games and Harry Potter are very much one author bringing their vision to you. They create a character and tell a story arc. Well, we've got 5 to 7 to 8 players, or 3 to 5, whatever. Hey, 1 to 10, right? Like 1 to 10 players all doing their story arcs, and together and in an iterative fashion, and not necessarily in a manner that would be entertaining, or at least designed to be entertaining for someone to watch. Like, I'm still amazed that people watch actual plays. I don't know about you, but do you watch actual plays? I mean, to me, when it first came out, I'm like, I like to play RPGs. I don't need to watch them, thanks. But it is a growing and very well supported part of our hobby now. It is just mind blowing to me because it's like, isn't the proof of the pudding is in the tasting, right? But some people like watching other people cook. I mean, cooking shows, like, you don't get to eat or smell the food on the cooking show, but cooking shows are really popular. So it boggles my mind, but to me, it's in the playing, and I think that's kind of why Hollywood doesn't always know what to do with RPG properties, and I think that's kind of why a lot of them are still well known and well respected within the fan communities, but aren't quite as mainstream yet because there hasn't been that mainstream breakthrough where, you know, the grandmas know about it because they took their grandkids to it 3 times over, you know, the vacation, or the little kids demand the toys from it. You know, those kind of interactions which demand, you know, non-fans to pay attention and know what's going on. I don't know that RPGs are as conducive to producing those properties just because we produce sandbox worlds and highly diverse worlds with diverse cultures and all these other little fiddly bits that you can come as an individual player and you choose the story you want to tell in that, versus stuff that's like, I mean, for instance, Indiana Jones, right? Like Savage Worlds is often, like we talked about earlier, famous for, it runs pulp high action well. Well, Indiana Jones is a premier property in the pulp high action sphere, except there hasn't been a successful Indiana Jones RPG. I mean, the one that TSR tried to do so famously crashed and burned that the Diana Jones Award
Yep.
is named after it. I mean, I was one of those idiots who was like, oh, Diana Jones must be a woman game developer who was influential in the founding of RPGs. No, Diana Jones is a pun off of, they burned the cover, one of the remaining covers of the Indiana Jones RPG, and what was left over was the phrase Diana and Jones, and they kind of encapsulated those burned cover pieces into a little perspex pyramid. And, you know, it kind of, it's turned into a joke about, you know, wonderful game design because, you know, everybody in the industry is kind of like, well, that one didn't hit the mark, I guess. I don't have a copy. I'd probably like it because I like Indiana Jones so much. But, you know, think about it. I mean, why does Indiana Jones fail as an RPG? Probably because so much of that story is written about one interesting character first and foremost, and everything else is kind of the mundane world. So who else would you play? Who else would you be in the Indiana Jones world? Well, if you're not indie, how else do you interact with that world? How many other adventuring archaeologists are there? Or sidekick, or, you know, femme fatale. I mean, there's not a whole lot of things that are different about indie. You just have a very charismatic guy, you know, as the main actor, and he gets to do the fun stuff. Whereas in Savage Worlds and other RPGs, we kind of typically design the archetypes and tropes for characters around everybody having a little bit of niche protection, everybody being able to affect the story, everybody having the ability to feel important and do amazing things. And then Hollywood can't handle that because, like, we can't have 6 stars, we can't have an ensemble, you know, those don't work well. And I think, like, things like Guardian of the Galaxy show that, you know, yeah, you can do that well. You can have the crazy squad and have everybody get their own, you know, interesting screen time. But, you know, otherwise there aren't a whole lot of successes there. So I think that's why our industry is I think it's growing. I think it will be a bigger industry in 20 years by far than it is today. But we do have that issue of recruiting new people and getting a little more mainstream attention. So,
Well, I think you hit on something there, though, specifically with, like you were talking about Indiana Jones, and I think you're right in that it's Indiana Jones is the story of Indiana Jones. And you're right, he's in a mundane world, and well, yes, you could play that and it would be fun. You are stepping into those shoes. And to take it to, I would say, the other famously adapted to RPG movie is Star Wars. But if you look at what gets played in Star Wars, most of the time, you're not playing the Skywalker saga.
Mm.
You're playing, you know, the ancillary stuff, the stuff that's going on 2 systems away, 3 systems away. You know, you're telling your own story within that universe. But I don't think in the context of Indiana Jones that those stories just they aren't there. They're too
Yeah.
visible as parallels.
Yeah, right, exactly. You 100%. And the in the Star Wars analogy too, I think my experience with playing Star Wars as an RPG, one, I agree with you, that you get it's well suited for an RPG because there's so much of the extended universe material, right? You have so many other authors who dip their toes in it, and because they were things that were hinted at in the movies, just small name drops, got fleshed out over time by other writers. You do have this there's a whole lot more going on than just the Skywalkers and the Palpatines. And I found, just from experience in playing those games, you almost have to go that way. Either everybody in the party is a Jedi or nobody's a Jedi, because striking the balance in an RPG is much more difficult than a movie where you just have writer fiat to make the non-demigod-like characters useful and interesting in every scene. But in an RPG where it's a little harder to put people on rails so much that you can really make all the other characters interesting, you almost have to everybody is a Jedi or nobody's a Jedi, because if you're playing for like GURPS, for instance, the Jedi are like a 600-point character and the mundanes are a 50-point character or a 25-point character, and it's like, well, great, you get to go 5 times around, I get to go once, so that just wouldn't be fun, because you're sitting there kind of watching the Jedi do the cool Jedi stuff. But you're right, because Star Wars did enough to have enough of an expansive world around it, there's room for the smugglers and the sidekick bowcaster furries, and for just being interesting, having stories to tell in that literal universe, because it's bigger like that. And I guess that's the appeal too of properties like Pathfinder. I mean, even though it's just, the Savage Worlds, there's definitely, I think, a chip on the shoulder of like Savage Worlds fans around fantasy, kind of before Lankmar came out and before Savage Pathfinder, that because there were other systems that just focused solely on fantasy or very much on fantasy, that Savage Worlds didn't need to, and then the appeal of Savage Worlds was kind of the other kind of genres you really couldn't play in a fantasy D20. But some people turn that into, well, Savage Worlds can't do fantasy, and I don't think that's true at all. I think those two iterative publications really show that, and even Rifts too. I mean, Rifts has got a lot of fantasy elements as well. Mm-hmm. It also has the kind of heavy lifting that fantasy has, where you've just got the scales of power are grand, and those are challenging from any kind of design point.
Yeah, very much.
Don't have to diss fantasy, but there is more out there. There is a wealth of other kind of game styles and gaming play. And, if anything, you answer the opposite question of like, is there something Savage Worlds doesn't do? My guess is more mechanical versus subject matter. I mean, I can't think of really any subject matter it can't handle, but mechanically, it's just so fun to have exploding dice. It's just so nice to have card initiative, that diceless, all kind of theater of the mind, no kind of mechanics. Savage Worlds has some elements that are like that, some modular elements that are for like interludes, or you kind of bolt on situational mechanics, but it really shines because of the crunch and the storytelling kind of match. And so to me, I don't think Savage Worlds would scratch the itch for people who are kind of let's just have a cooperative talking session that doesn't ever really get to combat, or doesn't ever really get to questions that need to be answered with random dice or with crunch. So that's the best I can give you on the what doesn't it do. So
fair. I was going to ask too, just because this is something that occasionally I'm in the mood for. It also strikes me that it might not do kind of a gritty, kind of low-powered game all that well because of the exploding dice and so forth. Like the example that immediately comes to mind would be something more akin to like a classic Warhammer fantasy type, where you're really just schmucks out there with a sword, but so to speak, playing infantry grunts in a trench game doesn't seem like it's just not, the system and the aesthetic you're going for don't seem to mesh well. Is that, do you think, fair?
I think it's fair with exploding dice, right? So if you have a system where you're gonna grind it out, and there's part of the assumptions are that you are eking out small successes versus being able to one-shot somebody. The exploding dice kind of remove that from the table, and I don't know that Savage Worlds would be fun without exploding dice. I do think if you want to walk that direction with the game, though, if you do want to get more gritty and you don't want to get as swingy, the easy tip I would suggest, one, you can do it with setting rules, and you can even make up your own. A lot of aces love making up their own setting rules to kind of to bring the flavor. For instance, there's a whole list of like zombie horror, right? Like are they smart zombies or are they stupid zombies? Are they slow zombies or are they fast zombies? Is everybody infected and when you die you become a zombie, or do you need to be bitten? If you're bitten, are you guaranteed to turn? Or there's a whole lot in that genre, right? There's a lot of different ways of playing that. So the way you in Savage Worlds you'd go after those is setting rules. And so like do you want gritty damage? Do you want to not be able to are wounds things do heroes never die, or are heroes eminently disposable? How hard is it to recover from wounds? Do wounds, those kind of things. You can monkey with those settings. And so one, setting rules, and then two, Benny economy. And this is a little more abstract, but one of the fun games that is a kind of high Cthulhu-esque horror in settings is called Realms of Cthulhu. And Sean Preston from an Ace license called Reality Blurs created it. And I played in one of his games at a convention, and he did the bennies you start with are the only bennies you're going to get in the game. And so this means that, at most, you're going to be able to re-roll 3 rolls. At most, you're going to be able to undo 3 wounds, or 3 successive wound attacks, 3 different attacks that wound you. So that right there turns the game very grim and very dark very quickly. So and you kind of do that with equipment too. So like in the game we were playing, we were basically inmates in an asylum who were trying to break out and who broke out. And when you make a choice to with those bennies, if you engage in physical combat with like a guard and you screw up, your character could be dead. I mean, it's not because of the swinging nature of it, just because you have limited resources to be able to make those rerolls. So I think if you were going on that grimdark style, that's how I would approach it in Savage Worlds. You limit the number of bennies that are going out, and then you put in some setting rules that make wounds a little more permanent, those kind of things. Like for instance, in the prior edition, being able to re-roll damage was a setting optional rule. You had to have that setting turned on if you were causing damage to be able to re-roll that. You could turn that back. It's standard now in Suede, but if you keeping critical failures, so you can't roll those, putting in the inability to reroll damage would start approaching what you want out of that kind of grimdark. So as written, definitely not as grimdarky, definitely more the little David can definitely bring down the giant Goliath with a sling stone one shot. But if you wanted to pare that back and make it a little more grimdark, do it with bennies and do it with some of the setting rules.
That's cool. I like that, so to speak. There are knobs there that you can tweak for that. And then, if you don't mind, I have one more question, I think, and that is, and then based on what I'm reading in the book and whatnot, that it seems like it's a game that kind of wants to be played with miniatures. Doesn't necessarily have to be, but is kind of maybe a little bit better with miniatures or tokens or something like that? Or does it handle full theater of the mind equally as well?
I think the nice thing about miniatures is that I think there's appeal for Savage Worlds with miniatures because you can throw a lot of miniatures out on the table and still get through the combat. So I think that's the opposite direction of the kind of the question you're asking. The question you're asking is like, if you're sitting in Savage Worlds land, do you like to walk over to miniatures land? To me, it's like if I'm in miniatures land and I like the painting and I like the fun and kind of the automatic note keeping that happens when you have a map of miniatures. You know how far apart characters are. where they're facing. A lot of the note keeping kind of secretarial stuff from other games that we all like to play is being done for you. Savage Worlds is an appealing choice because it can moderate those combats very well, where you can do 3 miniatures based combats. You can do everything from 2 and 3 mooks per player to just filling your board with characters, and then kind of that up down off the table system I mentioned earlier kind of keeps track of those miniatures. If we're talking about from Savage Worlds universe, and if do you want to walk towards Theater of the Mind or do you want to walk towards miniatures, I think you can do both. The one thing that's a little more challenging with pure Theater of the Mind is that there are a lot of statuses in Savage Worlds, and we've added more with Sway. So Shaken is a major status, but there's things like being entangled and being stunned and being vulnerable, and so there still is a little upkeep. And a lot of us, even if you're running miniatures, either use little colored rings you can put around the miniatures, like so Shaken is red and entangled is black and stunned is green or whatever, or you can use little like aquarium glass beads of different colors. So like reds could be the wounds. So and you're putting a red token next to your character for each wound. There are companies like Alea Tools, ALEA, that put out kind of little magnetic bases for your miniatures. You can stack up status effects, so you can see, oh, you're shaken and you've got 2 wounds, and you're entangled. Now you're vulnerable. So there are enough situational statuses where having some kind of method of information keeping, like miniatures, is handy, even if you're not even doing full-on tactical combat. Even if it's just you're putting a miniature figure on the table and you're putting a note, like for a lot of games, if we're just doing Theater of the Mind, I'll put a piece of paper down, mark the character name on the piece of paper, and I'll deal the card on that name, and then I'll put any status tokens on that name. So even it's kind of an easy note keeping kind of organizational tool. So even if we're doing Theater of the Mind, we still have I don't have to remember. I don't have to remember like, oh, you're shaken and wounded or whatever. So I think in that regard, it does do both well. And I think the simplicity of the system and the fact that you do have card initiative keeps people focused enough that when you're doing Theater of the Mind, they're still invested and they're still there, and you're not spending an inordinate amount of time telling people like what happened this last turn because they were spaced out or did a bathroom break or went to do something else for 20 minutes. So I would say it does both, and I always use both in any given con game I run. So there will be a big set piece battle usually at the end where we bust out the miniatures and do all the tactical stuff, but without it, it's still very generous. It's still very easy to be like, you can pull out the large burst template to figure out how many enemies are hit, or the rules tell you like roll 2d6 and add those together, and those will be the number of mooks that are captured in a large burst template, those kind of things. So it has both. It really can do Theater of the Mind. I like doing chases and other smaller encounters that aren't designed to take an hour. Like if I want to get into the 30 to 40 minute range of a scene, definitely able to do a Theater of the Mind. And really the only thing that requires is that your game master make some concessions on, like, just ask your players questions, like, or have them ask you questions. Like, for instance, gang up bonus is a thing in Savage World. So if you're in melee combat with an opponent, if you have another character adjacent to them, so it's not just on the opposite side, like I think Pathfinder and some of the D20s, you have to have very specific facing. But no, if there's another ally adjacent to them, you each get a +1 on your attack, and up to a +4 with 4 characters around that enemy. So if you don't have the miniatures busted out and you can actually count who's near who, you just kind of ask the questions like, hey, am I close enough to be adjacent to that enemy with so and so, or how many of us are adjacent to that monster, so for the gang up bonus, or line of sight. So simply just asking those questions, you can definitely run Theater of the Mind. So and almost every game I play in, game masters do a mix of both during any individual game session. So and then that kind of makes it unique. I mean, I don't know that other systems like D20 or GURPS or whatever really have that as an assumption that you're going to be able to do the theater of the mind elements and do the tactical elements at the same time or in the same session. But I think Savage Worlds is just kind of designed that way, and some of the newer elements that were added to Suede, like, you know, there's things called quick encounters that are a newer element, or even just like figuring out like how to do social conflict or travel or mass battles, right? Like you can do the mass battles with all the miniatures. There's even a mass battle system that requires no miniatures at all. You're literally you're keeping track of tokens versus your side and their side, and you're kind of in this race on depleting their tokens, you know, or bennies, so to speak, and adding to yours. So that's pretty much a theater of the mind. I mean, there's a little bit of bookkeeping in that you've got tokens on the table that are counting between the two sides, but you're not worried about facing, you're not worried about any of the smaller crunch. Yeah, same thing for dramatic tasks. You're really not worried about where the miniatures are on the table, who's facing where, what the ranges are. They're kind of just built in. And you know, similarly, there's chase rules. There's actually several versions of chase rules, and they're more customized things like the chase deck that came out with Pathfinder for Savage Worlds that are very tailored. Like in Buccaneer, we did our own chase rules that are very, you know, boarding and shooting and crew and cannon centric, to really kind of bring out the pirate flavor. So between all of those kind of, I think Savage Worlds calls it like the adventure toolkit chapter in Suede. Those are very much the subsystems that are optional, is probably not the best word, but you know, they're situational. They come up if your game master wants to use them. They're definitely they're not required, but they're ways of telling and storytelling that get away from the tabletop stuff. So I think Savage Worlds, it has the choice. It's literally your choice on how crunchy you want to get. So yeah, when you're sitting in Savage Worlds world looking at either, you know, tabletop crunchiness or theater of the mind, you can kind of hop back and forth between both of them during any one game session. So I think that's probably a unique advantage to the system.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. All right. Well, I have the distinct feeling that you and I could sit here and talk for quite a long time about this and keep going back and forth, but I would like to try and wrap this down into something of a normal episode length. So before we move on to the next thing, any more points you want to touch on regarding Savage Worlds that we haven't touched on yet?
No, man, join us. We're cool people. We're always looking for other gamers to join us. So I'll just mention that we've got we're starting to put on virtual conventions. And so this last Halloween, we did Hollerween. We've got an upcoming setting, which is Appalachian horror called Holler. Tim Early, was local here to Denver, but now he's in Nebraska, and then he's hopping back to North Carolina. He's a great guy with solid Appalachian roots.
Is that the folks that did, it was a podcast called The Old Gods of Appalachia?
So no, but that podcast would definitely be wonderful fodder for Holler. Similar kind of overtones, right? Like you've got, you know, Appalachian plus the weirdness. But yeah, the Holler is uniquely the creation of Tim Early. That the basic kind of theory is that it's set in about the 30s. That's kind of the tech level is 30s, and there's this veil that kind of separates the Holler from the outside world. And so it's got this kind of intimate, trapped, isolated nature to it, and the mechanics and the stories you're telling in that world that kind of make it unique. But if you like the Old Gods of Appalachia, I think you'd love Holler. So yeah, we put on Halloween, and we're probably going to do another Halloween again this year, if not another virtual convention before that. You can join us for the savageexpedition.com, where you can sign up for our newsletter. We're going to do a cruise. This year's cruise is 2022 in January. We're leaving out of Cape Canaveral, Port Canaveral in Florida, which is like Orlando. So if you want to come in for the New Year, celebrate the New Year in Orlando with either Star Wars or Harry Potter or the Space Center, and then get on a cruise and then play a lot of Savage Worlds for the next week, we are going to Belize. So we're going to hit up Costa Maya and Cozumel, and then Belize as our stops. Check out the savagecruise.com. And then in August, before that, we're going to go to Deadwood, South Dakota, to celebrate 25 years of Deadlands. So we're just you're going to take in the sights and sounds of Deadwood, and then play a lot of Savage Worlds, especially Deadlands. And so you guys are welcome to join us on both of those kind of excursions to enjoy some Savage Worlds. And then hopefully, as we're all kind of in the next year or two, as we're coming out of COVID, we'll see you guys more at some of the larger cons around the country. But yeah, so either whether it's digital or in person, there's ways to play Savage Worlds if you don't have a group near you.
Okay. Well, that sounds wonderfully fun. So I talked to you about this a little bit before we got started. And the thing that we try to do kind of at the end of every show is what we call Game of the Week, which is really just us kind of finding something and just to try and help people, because I think there are just a lot of people out there who are just not aware of how many different games are out there. And so what we do is we just, we pick a game, could be a Savage World setting. I mean, we've used all kinds of stuff in the past. But yeah, I think with this, then I think it's time to get into Game of the Week.
Nice. Game of the Week.
Game of the Week. Game of the Week.
Yes. And so I actually have two picked out here. So would you like me to go first, or would you like to?
Host privileges first, sir.
All right. Well, I was going to use something that you mentioned, I think, on the last episode of your podcast that dropped. It was the title, I believe. But then I found Titan Effect. And Titan Effect, which is a Savage Worlds setting, it's from Knight Errant Media. It is, to read the little blurb on drive through, it's a tactical espionage and science fiction RPG. It says the world is not what it seems. Ordinary people haven't realized how strange and dangerous it has become, but things are about to change. Psychics and bio-augmented humans work as spies and soldiers on behalf of criminal organizations, private military companies, and secret societies, all in a covert war that has been raging for decades. And so this is effectively it feels like James Bond and superheroes kind of all rolled together. It says it's a mix of biopunk, spy thriller, and superhero. And I haven't even really looked at this, but the tagline sells it for me. Have you had any experience with this?
It's fantastic. So the beyond the kind of cool content, right, where you've got the bio augmentation and the kind of paramilitary private kind of missions and shooters. Christian Nome, who's one of the team behind Knight Errant, I think it's Christian Nome and Jeff Ruiz. He's a rather amazing designer who puts in over-the-top skills on the PDFs they put out. And I know it's not intrinsic to the game, but if you buy Titan Effect, which I recommend you go do, the actual PDF for the game is amazing. He's coded it with special code where when you're operating the PDF, it's like you're operating a secret, high-tech tablet that the way it's kind of internally hyperlinked and usable, and the menus are just done so well in the graphic design and the layout that it feels like you're using kind of future tech tablets that are all incorporated. And so the attention to detail there on just the PDF coding and that bringing out the evocative nature of the setting is just so cool that, I mean, you should pick it up whether or not you want to play bio-augmented, kind of operatives and spies and shooters and all that. I mean, if you're a game designer listening to this and you put out anything in PDF, you should either hire Christian or give him a ring and check out the Titan Effect PDF just for the kind of quality, cool things you can do to tell an interesting story with the medium you're using. In this case, the digital PDF. But that's something that wouldn't be obvious if you haven't purchased it. That is not to be missed. So that's exciting. That's my tip for Titan Effect, is super fun, future tech. There's another similar setting that takes a very different spin, like your operatives, but instead of the bio-augmented engineered and future tech, you play corporate. It's the corporate structure, and you're playing gods and demigods of the Greek pantheon. That's called Olympus Inc. So you're also kind of playing, you can play non-humans, but you're, instead of being kind of, a lizard woman or, bio-augmented steampunky guy with claws or the ability to cast fire with your hands. You're playing demigods or sons of and daughters of the kind of the Greek pantheon as your inspiration. So those are they're similar in the fact that they're both mixing modern high tech guns and tech equipment, like equipment heavy gear list kind of games with some fun fantasy elements. So but the Titan Effect is fantastic.
Okay, cool. Would you say that was Olympus Incorporated?
Yeah, Olympus Inc.
Okay, that sounds interesting too. So, do you have anything you'd like to recommend to people?
So this one's a weird one. I won't take up too much more of your time because I do like to talk. There's a really this is kind of shows how far you can stretch what Savage Worlds can handle. So there's a great system called Low Life. It's done by an author named Andy Hopp, and the Low Life is it is pretty gonzo. It's set, as Andy says, gazillions of years in the future. The vaunted human race is extinct, and Oith's dominant life forms evolved from cockroaches, snack cakes, and the dregs that survived the various apocalypses in the highly original tabletop role-playing game. It's a spork and sorcery adventure in a shattered world inhabited by the descendants of worms and stranded aliens and the aforementioned snack cakes and cockroaches. There's dementalism, smell casting, contam animation, hocus pokery. So it's like this weird primordial soup kitchen kind of just fantastic weirdness. I mean, it is the product of a very demented but also very wonderful mind, and I think it shows off Savage Worlds in that there's it's just so crazy, and you pick it up to even just read through it and laugh at the wonderful puns and the kind of design choices Andy has made. It's whimsical and it's crazy. There's really nothing else like it that I can think of. It's out there and it's funny and it's hilarious, and you can play a fungus and or a spork or whatever. That kind of stuff is just it's so different than what you're expecting, and because Andy Hopp chose Savage Worlds for it, I think it speaks to being a system that can really challenge your expectations. So that's my pick, is Low Life by Andy Hopp.
All right. Yeah, I found that and I've added it to my wish list because that sounds entertaining at the very least. All right. Well, first off, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come talk with us. And we'll definitely have to find an excuse to have you come back at some point to talk about something else. But is there anything, I mean, I know you've mentioned some of this stuff already, but is there anything you'd like to plug, any contact information you'd like to give out, anything like that?
Yeah, the savagecast.com for the Savagecast podcast. Also in the, if you haven't heard enough from me already, which I'm pretty sure everybody listening has already heard enough from me for the year. But the savagecast.com, savagecruise.com, savageexpedition.com, anything else. If you need to contact me for any reason, even if it's just for hate mail, Chris.Landauer, Landauer @gmail.com is where you can find me. But other than that, on the horizon for Savage Worlds, Pinnacle is finishing up a Flash Gordon campaign that's got a couple more days left in it, if it's not already done, on Game on Tabletop. And then one of the major properties we talked a lot about tonight is probably one of the next up in the order of the great crowdfunders. And then one exciting things for new people to the show that's coming down later this year probably are the companions. And the companions are a cool set of books that allow you to expand the core rules for Savage Worlds to better adapt to the different kind of genres. So there's a sci-fi companion, a fantasy companion, a new, and these would be updated for Suede. And then a new companion, the martial arts companion, there hasn't been one out previously, is also in the works. Super's companion for superhero games. So just to wet the whistle for people who kind of want to take Savage Worlds for a spin, but have their own genre of choice. Stick with us at Pinnacle this year to see what's coming up, because those will be some really big crowdfunders, probably Kickstarters, coming up between now and 2022. So,
all right, sounds awesome. Yeah. So, like I said, thank you for taking the time, and really had fun talking with you, and learned a hell of a lot. and I'm really excited to dive back into this book among the other, I don't know, 6 or 7 other RPG books I'm trying to read at the moment.
Yeah, glad you found it. And then if anybody out there needs help finding games to play in, drop me a line. The as we mentioned before, the virtual tabletop is here to stay, and there's a lot of great Savage Worlds games going on. So if you want to get into the system, that's probably a good way to start.
Alrighty. Well, then, if you don't have anything else, I think it's time to remind folks to be kind to one another and get out there and play some RPGs. And of course, also, if you'd like to contact us here at the show, all the contact information's in the show notes, and I'll get most of these links and stuff I'll get from Chris, and I'll put them in the show notes as well. So, all right, folks, take care, be kind to each other.
Intro and outro music by the band 12 Noon. You can email us at meandsteverpg@gmail.com. You can also find us at facebook.com/meandsteverpg. Thank you, and be kind to each other.
How much for the cigar?
Cigar, $20, dog. You gotta go down the street to the store and buy that.